Hello, Cloud Hire family. My name is Sufiyan and Dr, CEO and founder of Cloud Hire, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Solange Charas, CEO of HC Moneyball, adjunct professor at Columbia, NYU, University of Southern California, University of Washington, a distinguished research fellow of the Conference Board, member of ISO Global Standards Committee, and author of Humanizing Human Capital. Hello, Dr. Charas. How are you?
Exhausted based on that list of things I'm doing. How are you?
I'm good. So, Dr. Charas, we've been really excited on unpacking an incredible episode on human capital and your role in data analytics around human capital. Before we do dive in, we'd like to lay some groundwork. How would you describe what human capital is for our audience?
So human capital is the next evolution of what we're thinking about in terms of human resources. And human resources was the evolution from personnel. So in the old days, we used to think about personnel being the people that work in the company. And then human resources, the next iteration was a little bit more sophisticated in terms of not just thinking about people, but also thinking about people and programs. So if you think back to like the 1950s, really all we did for people was pay them and give them benefits. And then the next iteration, we started thinking about, well, should we offer training and development? Should we have specific approaches in the way that we hire people and what we hire them for? And then how to train them and then how to move them through the organization. And we thought about human resources more as a system, as a way to manage people so that they stay with us. Attract, retain, and motivate is the old thinking. And then human capital is the next iteration of that. So it's a higher level where we're not just thinking about how do we attract, retain, and motivate people, but how do we integrate human capital as a driver of economic value creation for the organization. And what we're seeing now is a watershed moment where we're reframing, we're rethinking about the role of people in an organization. So the old framework, or probably the framework that still is in place for many, many companies, is that people are a cost. And they're thought of by management as a cost, right? You have to pay people, you have to give them benefits. There are costs associated with all sorts of programs, recruiting, training, mobility, performance management, right? All of these activities are really a cost and thought of as a sunk cost, where we just have to invest, but we don't necessarily expect a return on that investment. The more modern thinking now is that human capital is not just merely an expense for a company, but it's actually an investment in an intangible asset. And luckily, that's not just my thinking. That's what the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that's their position. And in 2020, they actually came out publicly and said exactly that human resources is not just an expense, but it is an investment in an intangible asset. And when we think of the word investment, we automatically think of a return on investment, right? So in your personal lives, when you put money in the bank, you expect to get some type of a return on that investment. Or when you invest in a company stock, you're focused on how can my money grow when I invest in something. Much the same way, there's a new orientation, a new way of thinking about human resources or human capital, which is how do we measure, monitor, and optimize the investments that we're making in people so that we can lift company performance over time. Is that enough of a context? Too much, maybe?
No, I think that's an excellent context. I think that's exactly what we need to understand as an audience. I always view it as the same thing. I've seen the trend where people kind of view employees as a sunken cost, as you said. And every time they're adding an employee, they're thinking about how their costs are scaling accordingly. But they're not looking at the intrinsic value that the employee will bring to the organization in the long run and what type of impact that can have on the bottom line. So if we value people as assets, then we can actually see a really high ROI, especially if they're performing the way that they should for the organization.
Exactly. And the more you invest in people the right way, the more productive those people will be. And the more productive the people are, the better off the company is in terms of performance. And I think companies make money. They make money by selling stuff or providing services. And that's revenue. And then you subtract the expenses that are associated with running a company, and what's left over is profit, right? So think about your own paycheck. You get a paycheck, you have to pay your living expenses out of it, and then what's left over is disposable income. Some people save it, some people spend it, but it's like personal profit, right? It's what's left over. And if we think about humans being, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but if you think of humans as being the engine of revenue creation, and in the United States, 87% of our economy is service oriented. And the only way that you can deliver services is through people or augmented by people. For many organizations, especially professional services firms, people are the driver, the engine of revenue creation. So if you start thinking about people as either creating more revenue, or you think about managing people in a way that reduces expense, like attrition is a big expense for an organization. So if you enhance revenue and you reduce expense, you're going to have more profit. And people are the center of that algorithm, right? That formula.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly right there. The real base cause for when we started our organization was to create a workspace that people would love to stay at. Attrition was something that I really wanted to combat. Seeing the global work economy, most of the companies that are on top have a crazy high attrition rate in which about every 4 years you practically have a new company. The sunken cost must be insane considering how hard it is to find and train really good human capital. So, having a model that lets you define and maintain retention is absolutely essential to keep your costs down. And I think that it's devalued in a lot of organizations. They're willing to lose people over a couple dollars and they don't understand how much of an impact it's going to be to rehire and retrain. And, just might as well focus on that person's career development and see how much impact they could have brought to the bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. And, the book that Stella Lapouchard and I wrote called Humanizing Human Capital, and the subtitle is Invest in Your People for Optimal Business Returns, is really putting the human in the center of the business model. So one of the things that you just talked about was attrition. And people leave organizations for lots of different reasons, mostly because they're either, and we probably weren't going to talk about this, but I'm going to mention it, a toxic work environment. So the culture has to be a good fit. They leave because they're not getting what they need out of work. And what's interesting is what employees need is really generationally specific. So if you're a baby boomer like me, and you're running the human resources function, your natural lens is going to be to see human resources through your own preference, right? So what do baby boomers want? We want extrinsic rewards. We want money. We want benefits. We don't really need to have our purpose satisfied, right? We have different needs. We want comp benefits. We want job security. We want a little bit of work-life balance. But if you look at what Gen Xers want, or you look at what millennials want, it's different. So we need to be human capital centric. We need to actually listen to the needs of our employees so that we can design programs to satisfy their needs, to make them stay and work harder and work smarter. So you can't just say, oh, we give people pay and benefits and job security, they should be happy. Because if you look at what the millennials want, they mostly want to work for companies that have a good reputation. They want to feel heard and have emotional safety. They want to be able to play with new technologies. They want a lot of development, personal development, and they want it constantly and quickly. So offering them a lot of pay and benefits and nothing else is not going to satisfy them. And then if you look at the Gen Xers, they want interesting work. They want good work-life balance. They also want job security, and they want good pay and benefits. So if you've got, right now we have 5 generations in the workforce. How do you manage human resources? How do you design HR programs that will enhance the relationship, the value perception of the employee that the organization is giving them when everybody wants something different? And that's where data analytics comes into play. So, and so I'll just say this one thing and then we can come back to it. So the workplace is very complex, and data analytics is the antidote to complexity. Mm-hmm. So if you can apply data analytics to understanding behaviors in your organization, then you can create a roadmap for a pathway to a successful future. Much better than the old way, or maybe even for some organizations, the current way of understanding, of planning programs, which you stick your finger in and you try to figure out which way the wind is blowing, and then you design, maybe we should do more training and development, or maybe we should do recruiting differently. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't have to guess. If we use data analytics, the data tells us exactly what we should be doing to satisfy the needs of the organization to support business outcomes.
Yeah, 100%. I really like that you kind of transition into it, because while you were speaking, I was going to say, okay, so this is exactly where data analytics is needed. But yeah, in HR, we develop programs that we think are going to benefit our people, or rather the organization. But it's really difficult in most cases to put a quantity or financial performance outline on what actually happens from the changes that we make. And that's exactly what you specialize in. So, I would love to kind of help the audience understand how we can use analytics to determine what financial outcomes can happen when we invest further into human capital.
Yeah, and that's excellent. So let me just preface this by saying that we're seeing an evolution in the human capital space. So think about what happened when COVID hit. We saw a lot of turnover in the top job, the top HR job, because CEOs realized that they don't need good HR administrators to keep the wheels on the bus. They need somebody that's more strategic, that can create an agile workforce, that can manage a remote or a hybrid workforce, that can better manage all this, disruption in a way that makes sense for the organization. And so of all the C-suite positions, we saw the highest turnover in the CHRO role right when COVID started and through COVID. And Stella and I believe that we're going to see another disruptive event in the C-suite with that CHRO position, or that top HR position, from what we now have, which is somebody who can manage an agile workplace, a workforce, and be more empathetic, right? Because that's what we needed during COVID. We needed a lot of empathy. We needed a lot of human part of it. But we now predict that the requirements to be a successful human capital practitioner, especially leading the function, is going to be focused on 2, maybe 3 fundamental things. The first is knowing the business. So many HR people don't understand what their businesses do. And that's critical, right? And that's what I tell my students is learn your business, learn the business model, figure out, ask people, go and interview your CFO or your CEO or your chief operating officer, your chief administrative officer. Go and interview them and ask them, how does the company make money? What is the business that we're in? And what are the key critical parts of our business strategy that need to be met for us to be successful? So know your business. The second is financial literacy. So the language of business is finance, and most HR people don't speak finance. And many, many HR people that I speak to tell me, like, point blank, if I wanted to do math, I wouldn't have gone into HR. So, and I get that. I understand that maybe you don't want to do math and maybe you don't want to be a financial person, but you have to be able to speak the language of business, and the language of business is finance. At Columbia, I teach a class called Finance for Effective Human Capital Management, where the students actually learn finance, right? They're not going to learn it to be a financial person, but they're going to learn it to be able to understand a balance sheet, an income statement, right? And those are the two primary statements that they have to understand, and be able to create a context for understanding how does human capital drive the
growth and the income
performance,
statement.
Right? So financial literacy is super important. And the other is data analytics. So you don't have to be a data analytics person. You don't have to learn how to program in R or Python, but you have to have a data analytics mindset. You have to be able to measure and quantify performance, important against HR KPIs, but even more important against company KPIs. So you have to connect the dots between what's happening in HR and the outcomes, the performance outcomes there, and how that's actually impacting bottom line performance for the organization. And so what Stella and I are sort of expecting is that the CHRO of the future will not actually be an HR person. The CHRO of the future will be a business person coming out of operations or coming out of production or coming out of marketing or sales or coming out of finance or coming out of legal, because they understand the business. And then the HR talent underneath that business person will be the subject matter experts that help the top HR person coordinate and manage the impact of the function.
That makes total sense to me. I see it already happening in most cases. Having somebody that has strong understanding of where the revenue is driven from an organization is best able to control, what pieces, or rather human capital, they're picking up to expand their organization. Intrinsically, though, we've been talking about using data analytics to kind of figure out how we can have better financial outcomes. What are some of the aspects you're looking at in an organization, and how does it drive financial outcome exactly? And how do you go about measuring it?
Excellent question. A lot to unpack. So let me start with the last question and then move backwards. So there are specific human capital metrics that, when calculated, will provide information about the impact of human capital performance in the aggregate on company outcomes. So the mother of all measures is something called HCROI, Human Capital Return on Investment. And what HCROI does is it helps organizations figure out whether or not dollars invested in human capital are actually generating a return or are deleterious. So it's actually creating a loss for the company. And the way that we calculate HCROI, and sorry for those people that don't like math, but it's important, is revenues minus expense, right? Remember before we said, if you take your revenues and you subtract your expenses, you get profit, right? Mm-hmm. So for HCROI, what we're doing is we're taking revenues and we're subtracting expense adjusted for the cost of human capital. So let's put some numbers around this. If revenue is 100 and expense is 50, right? Then your profit is 50. To get the numerator of HCROI, let's say your human capital costs are 30. Let's make the numbers easy. So you would take 100 and subtract 50 minus 30, which is 20, right? Mm-hmm. So the numerator is now 80, and your denominator is going to be 30, which is the cost of human capital. So revenue minus expense adjusted for the cost of human capital divided by the cost of human capital. And when you get that number, if it's above 1, then for every dollar you invest in people, you are getting a positive return on investment.
Okay, of 2.33 or whatever it is.
Yeah, if it's less than $1, then for every dollar you're investing, you're getting less than $1 back. So that HCROI indicator tells you whether or not you have a baseline measure of effectiveness and efficiency in the dollars that you're spending on people, right? If it's negative, you need to do something right away because you're hurting the company. Okay. If it's positive, it's a good thing, and you want that positive number to grow. The bigger HCROI is, the bigger your profitability is, because we're using the same numbers. It's just math. Mm-hmm. So the first thing companies should do is measure whether or not they have greater than 1 HCROI. 1 is break even. Anything above 1 is good. Anything below 1 is bad. And then that you use that as a baseline. Use that as sort of a way to figure out, how do we create more value? How do we make HCROI go up? Because as HCROI goes up, profits go up. So then you have to start unpacking. So that's the first question, is how do you measure? The first thing you measure is HCROI. There are other measures as well, like HCVA, Human Capital Value Add, or HEVA, Human Economic Value Add, or if you're a public company, HCMV, Human Capital Market Value. So all of these measures, these metrics, transform HR performance into a financial indicator that you can then use to say, we're creating value for the company, we're at a break even, or we're destroying value for the company. So that's the first thing. And then you start unpacking the programs underneath HR. So you can look at recruiting. Are you doing it well? Is it bringing you value, right? And it's not just about how many dollars you're spending. It's the quality of the people that you are recruiting. How do you measure that? How long do they stay? Do they stay longer than the average tenure of your employees? Do they stay shorter, which is not good? How about mobility? What Stella and I say in the book is you shouldn't hire people for that first job. You should be thinking about, how do we hire people for the job after that? So look at the promotion arc of the talent that's being hired, right? So those are some things that you can measure around recruiting. You can look at performance management the same way, right? Are we giving people the skills that they need in learning and development so that they demonstrate performance to the expectation of the job or beyond, right? So there's so many things that we can measure in HR, because if you think about the HR function, it's not just one function. It's like 9 sub-functions, right? It's 9 processes, or even more, depending on different companies, how they think about it. And so, Michael Porter said, whatever you measure improves. So what we need to do is we need to transform HR and HR outcomes into something that's measurable so that we can improve that at the program level, so that HCROI improves, so that company profitability improves.
Amazing. I'm really excited to put these metrics down on my current organization and see where we stand and where I can improve, our bottom line for human capital. I'm a firm believer that human capital is absolutely everything, and identifying, finding the best talent and putting it in your organization is going to lead to your ultimate success. So it would be absolutely phenomenal to kind of be able to quantify that and showcase that to, clients, that this is the value that our human capital adds. A thing that I remember speaking to you about in our initial catch-up was engagement, and the value of engagement in a company and how it can affect the financial outcome of the firm in a huge way per dollar invested. Would you like to dive into that and kind of explain to the audience how important it is to measure engagement in a company, how we can measure it, and what the ultimate effect is once we start investing dollars into engagement for a firm?
Absolutely. So there's a preponderance of research, of academic research, that supports this idea that more engaged employees are more productive, and more productive employees help companies be more sustainable and more profitable. So you have to buy into the fundamental notion that engagement is really the root of good or bad, if there's low engagement, right, outcomes for the organization. And I recently did a measurement study for an organization that has an engagement tool. And so we'll call them Company A, and their tool is in Company B. And what we did is we quantified the financial impact of the effectiveness of the Company A's product in Company B's performance. So Company A, when they introduced the product to Company B, knew that they would get some good results because that's what their product does. It generates good results. And what they were measuring really as an outcome variable were two things. One is the level of engagement of the employees in the organization. So they survey them and they figure out how engaged they are. And then the product is introduced, which is basically a way to institutionalize dialogue between managers and subordinates in a very productive and non-threatening way. And then they measure engagement over time. And so the product had been in the company for 3 years. And over those 3 years, the level of engagement of their employees was going up. So we knew the product was working for engagement. And the other thing that they measured was attrition. And what they found was as people were more engaged, their attrition went down, which you would imagine, right? So if I'm engaged in my work and I like what I'm doing and I like the relationship that I have with my manager, I'm not likely to leave. I'm likely to stay. So what they were able to say is the use of the product made engagement go up and attrition go down, but they couldn't quantify the economic value of that. So what I did is I went in and I have a team of people behind me, so it's not just me. And we started looking at the relationship between engagement going up and we measured productivity, and productivity was going up. And we were able to quantify that. So we saw that productivity, per employee productivity, went up about 25% over that period of time. So the same number of people are doing 25% more work, in other words. We also saw attrition go down, and we were able to quantify the cost savings associated with attrition going down. So remember before I said we want revenue to go up and cost to go down? This is exactly what that engagement tool was producing for Company B. People were more productive and they weren't leaving the company. So they didn't have to spend money to replace leavers. And what we found was that the return on investment of that product, so what they were spending for the product compared to the benefits associated with more productivity and less expense, was about 300%. It's actually a little bit more than 300%.
That's 300% in 3 years?
300% per year.
Per year. Wow.
Yeah.
That's destroying every hedge fund gain that you can possibly have.
Exactly right. So now the head of HR can go to the CFO and say, I want more funding for this program, right? Because now we can say for every dollar invested in the program, the company is saving $300 and some odd in expense, right? Forget about the productivity. Let's just look at the hard dollar cost of replacing people who are leaving. And the people, who were leaving because they were not happy with the company in the past. So now the CHRO can go to finance and say, I want another X number of dollars, $100,000, $200,000, $1 million. But now the CFO can say, oh, if I give this program money, I know what my return is going to be, right? I'm going to give them $1 and I'm going to avoid $300 in cost. That cost avoidance can go to pay for something else, pay down debt or invest in other things, right?
Yeah, or just sit in the bank.
Or just put it in the bank, which
exactly.
Most companies would probably pay down debt because they'd rather not pay interest, as the interest expense on borrowing is higher than the interest that they'd earn in a deposit. So, they have to make all sorts of decisions, and it's not necessarily, they also, CFOs look at future, right? So where are they going to need liquidity? So there's all sorts of things that go into decisions about how to allocate money. But in the past, human resources never showed a return on investment. So remember at the beginning, we talked about human capital, the money that we pay for people is really an investment in an intangible asset, and that investment needs a return. So now what we're doing is we're helping HR people quantify the return on investment in human capital and at the program level. So this CHRO has this engagement, but she might also have a learning and development. And if we use data analytics to understand the benefits generated from investment in learning and development, maybe that's a 400% return. So now the CHRO can say, how am I going to invest the money that I have for HR programs? I'm going to invest it in the program that gives me the highest return on investment. So maybe instead of putting all $100,000 in the engagement, she's going to put $50,000 in learning and development and $50,000. She's going to, she has, or he has the option of figuring out how to allocate the budget that will generate the highest return for the organization by making sure that she addresses what the employees really want and value to keep them, and to keep them engaged and to keep them productive. So it's a system, and the role of data analytics is providing those kinds of insights. Instead of guessing, I'm doing data analytics, I'm seeing the numbers, and I'm making decisions based on evidence and based on data, rather based on gut.
So if I, as an organization, were to approach you, or rather HC Moneyball, to kind of set up these analytics for me, is that your core function, to set up these analytics and then put in a dashboard so I can see where my, ROI might be highest?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple of ways of working with organizations. One is we have a software solution. So if you want to do the data analytics on your own, that's fine. It's a SaaS product, so you subscribe. We'll help you set up all your data, and then every month you'll add in new data, and then you can look at trends, and you can create your own analytics by doing simple drag and drop. So maybe you want to understand attrition to investment in training, or maybe you want to look at tenure based on salary costs. So you want to understand the relationship between things that are happening in HR. And we let you do that with very simple drag and drops that create these dashboards. So that's the first way. We've actually found that companies would rather take an Uber than buy the car. So the software solution, why drive? So the software solution is buying the car, and then working with us as a consultant is basically hiring an Uber. So you give us the data, we drive the car, we give you the insights, we do all the analytics, we baseline, we benchmark against your competitors, we create the narrative, we create the business case for you. So basically all you have to do is go to your senior leadership and say, here's our current performance, here's how it's benchmarked against our competitors, here's what our hypothesis on future benefit, and here's how much money we want for these different programs. And it's all done as a business case with, the right kind of analytics, the right kind of financial language. So one of the things that I sort of joke about is we're like the Rosetta Stone. So we take human capital data and we transform it into financial data so that the CFO, the CEO and the board, depending on, what your company is like, can understand the impact of HR in a language that they understand.
Mm-hmm. I completely understand on a large scale for companies that have a lot of data, how this could immediately become effective for them. But do you have a recommendation for how big or, how much data one would need before they can get started for something like this?
Yeah. So our rule of thumb is you should have about 100 employees in your company for the data analytics to have validity and reliability. So I have actually worked with companies that only have 50 employees, but the data gets a little wonky because if you have one or two people leave and it looks like an anomaly, then it throws off the sort of the trend analysis. So with 100 employees or more, and the bigger the employee population, the easier it is to get really reliable trend and really reliable analytics. So if, 100 employees is probably the cutoff for doing really good analytics and getting really good insights. But even with fewer than 100 employees, you should be thinking about that financial impact, right? So you can still figure out your cost of attrition. You can still figure out your productivity per employee. So you can still do some of the metrics, but the data, the more sophisticated data analytics, the predictive analytics get a little bit wonkier. So, and even with smaller organizations, you should still be doing descriptive analytics. You should still be looking at data, summarized data. So what is our attrition rate? It's amazing to me that I can speak to CHROs and sophisticated CHROs in mid and large size companies. And I ask them, what's your attrition rate? And they don't know. They have no idea. So some fundamental basic things like average tenure. So in the United States, the average tenure, excluding executives for the general workforce, is about 28 months.
Okay.
So
less than 3 years.
2 years and 4 months. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Less than 2.5 years. Yeah. And, you should be tracking and monitoring that. You should be tracking and monitoring your attrition rate. At what speed are your employees leaving you? There's certain things that are just easy to understand. And then, so that's descriptive analytics where you're just describing what happened, right? Then you can move into diagnostic analytics, which answers the question, why did that happen? So if we see our attrition rate is 8%, right? You want to dig into the numbers. Was the 8% comprised of people that have less than 1 year of tenure? Or maybe your long tenured employees are leaving you, right? And that's not good.
Yeah.
Neither of them is good. Yeah. Maybe it's everyone's leaving or the majority of people are leaving from your IT function, right? So we want to answer the question, what happened and why did it happen? And then the next level of analytics is what's going to happen. And that's where you need more data to be able to do predictive analytics. But you can still understand what's going on in HR by transforming it into numbers and measuring that. And that's really important. That's a key a key competency that's going to be required. And not just because it's good business, it's because your management and your board are going to ask for this information. Why? Because the SEC is asking for this information, or at least will be asking for this information. So if you have somebody outside of the organization saying, I want to see these numbers, then the organization has to create it. And please, HR practitioners, don't give this up to your financial people. They don't know how to interpret the numbers. You know how to interpret the numbers. So screw up a little courage, do a little math, right? Do a little math and keep that power inside of HR to be able to create the numbers and interpret them, tell the story, because it's all about storytelling now, right?
Yeah, 100%. Using data to have a compelling narrative that speaks to all of your stakeholders is absolutely essential. And, it doesn't just end with your management and your board. It's the shareholders, it's the workers and the employees, everything all around. And I think the way that you use analytics to do it is absolutely phenomenal. I'm very interested, and I came across your profile and we invited you to this conversation after reading your book. And it was absolutely eye-opening for me because, being in the HR industry myself, being in the place of hiring global talent, and the main chief revenue driving factor for us is our talent, working for people. Retention is really important. Finding good talent and keeping them engaged long term is really important for us. It speaks to the LTV of our client, how long they're going to stay. Having low attrition versus high attrition is impacting our valuation in a lot of sense. And we have a higher valuation than our competitors because we're able to retain the talent in a longer way. And I think I'm so excited to dive in and use all of the metrics that you've highlighted in your book and, get to the place where I can call you for consultancy.
Anytime. Happy to help.
Of course. Well, Dr. Charas, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here today. And I push everybody to please go to the link in the podcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead into the comments. There's a link to buy Dr. Charas's book. It's 100% must read if you're at the executive level. It will teach you how to gamify your HR and, maximize your profits. And if you're just aspiring, then you should have the knowledge so you could get ahead in your career. Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Charas, for our listeners before we hop off?
Yeah, sign up for the newsletter. So if you go to the book's website, there's a place there to sign up for the newsletter. Stella and I write a blog and a blog post and embed that in a newsletter and send that out every month. And we're really excited because this year we're going to tackle how to actually redesign jobs to incorporate AI into those jobs. And everyone's talking about it, but nobody's actually showing you how to do it. And so we're going to have a series of blog posts that actually walk an HR practitioner through the process of identifying aspects of jobs that can be augmented or supplemented by AI. And you'll want to read about that because it's happening.
Yeah, it's happening right now. Exactly what I mean, right? Like getting the book, signing up for the newsletter, it'll let the audience get ahead of the curve in dealing with competition within their own industry, and it'll be invaluable for them and the organization's bottom line.
And also link into me and LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn. Of course. Dr. Charas is very active on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think I'm the only Solange Charas there, so you don't have to even search too hard to find me. Just, link in and follow. And I post a lot of interesting things there. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we hope to see you in a different season. Thank you, Dr. Charas.
Thank you.